So thank you so much for joining us this morning. So we're just going to be talking about this, a practical overview of the European Accessibility Act today, what it is, who it affects, and what steps your organisation might need to consider to ensure your compliance and create sort of more inclusive digital experiences. So just before we get started, just a quick bit of kind of housekeeping. So just to note that if you do want to turn on captions for whatever reason, you just need to go to the three wee dots in your Teams toolbar and select language and speech, and then show live captions, and then they'll appear at the bottom as well if you need it. We'll also be taking questions at the end, so if you maybe just save your questions for the QA at the end, and then we'll run through any questions that you may have. And yeah, we'll just get started. So just a quick introduction about to ourselves. So I'm Kieran, one of the accessibility consultants here at UserVision. So I've been here for about 2.5 years now. I've worked on multiple audits from public sector, private sector, third sector, facilitated training for different clients, facilitated empathy workshops, audited documents, apps, you name it, I've done it in accessibility. So yeah, I'll pass over to Harjit, who's joining me today as well.
Thanks, Kieran. Yeah, good morning, everyone. My name's Harjit. I'm a senior accessibility consultant here at UserVision. I work with an accessibility team, and I've been here for about 5.5 years now. So I've worked with different teams across different sectors, private sector, retail and financial services. I've conducted a lot of accessibility audits over the years, and I enjoy conducting usability testing with disabled people and delivering training to help organisations embed accessibility. So I'll pass you back over to Kieran.
So just a quick look at our agenda for this morning. So I'll be starting with giving us a quick overview of the European Accessibility Act. Then I'm going to be passing to Harjit to go over sort of steps to compliance and things that you can do. And then we'll have a wee look at some key takeaways from today's session that hopefully you can maybe implement in as you strive for EAA compliance as well. So as I say, we'll start off with just a quick overview of the European Accessibility Act. So first, what is the European Accessibility Act, or EAA? So the EAA is an EU directive aimed at improving accessibility for people with disabilities across member states. It focuses on key products and services that are essential for everyday life, like ATMs, e-books, websites, all of these kind of things. And one of the main goals is to ensure a consistent standard across the EU. So that means organisations across all EU member states and outside of the EU, if you serve EU customers, will all be working to the same set of expectations. Importantly, the EEA helps promote digital inclusion and supports a more harmonised internal market. So this benefits businesses too as well, because it reduces the complexity of complying with different accessibility rules in each country. So it just makes it a lot easier as there's just one overarching rule or law that you need to follow. But the EEA isn't just about meeting legal requirements. Ideally, it gets people thinking about going beyond compliance as well. So about creating more inclusive, usable digital experiences just for everyone, including the 101 million people in the EU with a disability. So obviously it's such a large demographic of people that will be helped by this legislation. There we go. So let's build on that overview with just some key details about the EEA as well. So the European Accessibility Act, or EAA, is a EU-wide directive, meaning it's mandatory, and its aim is to provide or is to improve access to both digital and physical products and services for people with disabilities. So we'll cover what those industries and services are in the next slide, but from here we'll just so it applies both to public and private sector organisations. The law covers anyone involved in delivering products or services, including manufacturers, distributors, importers, and service providers, regardless of whether they operate in the public or private sector. And although the UK is no longer part of the EU, the EEA still applies to any organisations selling into the EU, regardless of where they're based. For example, a UK e-commerce business offering products to EU customers must ensure its websites and purchasing processes are accessible. The key factor is who the end user is and not where the company is located. On the other hand, if a UK company buys a service from a EU-based vendor, such as maybe a payment gateway, the EEA only applies to the vendor if the service is used within the EU. So if it's used within the UK, it doesn't apply. And it's worth noting that the EEA doesn't replace any other accessibility laws. So it sets a harmonised EU-wide standard, but other legislation such as the EN 301, 549 still exist, and national governments may decide how they incorporate or enforce those requirements. Some may adopt stricter rules or additional obligations as well. So just a little bit of kind of what the EEA is built on. So it's built on the EN 301 549, which is the EU's accessibility standard for ICT products and services. So it incorporates WCAG 2.1 and is expected to include WCAG 2.2 in the future. So if your organisation is already working towards WCAG compliance, that's a strong starting point. But remember, the EEA may go further, especially around procurement processes, documentation, and ongoing monitoring, which we'll touch on a wee bit later as well. And finally, each EU member state is responsible for enforcement, and non-compliance can lead to penalties such as fines, legal action, or restrictions on market access as well. So it's important to make sure that you are complying, otherwise you might incur all of these kind of fines and things like that as well. So as I mentioned previously, it covers a lot of different services, products and services. So the EAA has a strong transactional focus. It's not just about making sure that your website's accessible overall. It's about ensuring that every step leading to this, the completion of a sale or use of a service is accessible. So it's important to make sure that every aspect of a purchasing journey, from contacting customer support, adding a product to your basket, entering card details, and checkouts are all accessible. So that whole process needs to be as accessible as possible to comply as well. So which industries are impacted? First is e-commerce platforms and online services. So if you sell products online, as I say, your full product journey, purchasing journey must be accessible. Also, banking and financial services are also in scope. That includes things like online banking platforms, ATMs, and payment terminals as well. Transport services are also included. So whether it's booking tickets for a train, checking in at an airport, or accessing travel update information must also meet these accessibility standards. Then we have telecommunications, ebooks, and related services, and retailers selling digital products like software or streaming subscriptions. And finally, the EEA extends to audiovisual platforms, emergency services, and digital communication tools like Zoom, WhatsApp, Netflix, and even the EU-wide emergency number of 112, as well as all within scope of the EEA. So it's a broad scope and covers both the tools people use and services they rely on every day. So it's important just to make sure that your products and services across the board are as accessible as possible. So let's take a moment to walk through the sort of key timeline and deadlines for the EEA. These dates help clarify who needs to do what and by when. So we'll go back to 2022, when EU member states were required to notify the EU Commission of how they plan to implement the EEA within their own national laws. this early step sort of laid the groundwork for how the Act would be enforced across different countries. So looking ahead to the main compliance date that probably a lot of you will already know, which is the 28th of June this year. So from this point, any new product or service launched to the market must be accessible from day one. And by new, we mean anything first introduced or made available on or after that date. So that includes maybe a brand new website, a refreshed app, or newly released self-service terminal. The idea is that accessibility should be embedded into design from the outset. Then we've got the 28th of June 2027, which is the specific deadline for emergency services, particularly platforms that support the EU-wide emergency number 112. So these services have an extra 2 years to meet compliance, just sort of recognizing how complex that the changes could be made to these critical systems. And then after that comes the 28th of June 2030. This marks the end of this sort of transactional period for any existing product or service that were already existed before the 2025 deadline. So if those are still on the market by 2030, they must be brought into compliance unless they've been retired or significantly replaced. And finally, there's the 2045 deadline. This is the final exemption date. Some long life services, self-service terminals like ATMs or ticketing kiosks are allowed a 20-year window to meet accessibility requirements. But if they undergo significant updates before that, they need to be made compliant sooner. So these are the key dates, and they're worth keeping in mind as you're planning for maybe audits or remediation or updates across your services. So there are a couple of exemptions that come under the EAA as well. So the first exemption is just archived websites and files are exempt. So content that's not been updated after it's mandatory to purely for archive purposes, so it's okay. So this might include legacy websites or static digital reports kept online. So that's the first exemption there. There's also organizations defined as micro enterprises. So that is service providers with fewer than 10 employees and an annual turnover of under 2 million. Are exempt from service-related requirements. This is intended to reduce the sort of burden on these smaller businesses, although a lot of smaller businesses are probably still going to try and opt in for best practice, sort of on a voluntary basis as well. Pre-recorded media such as audio and video content published before the compliance deadline is also exempt, but if content is produced or updated after that the 28th of June 2025 deadline, it will need to meet accessibility requirements as well. Office file formats, including documents like PDFs, Word, Excel spreadsheets, are exempt as long as they were published before the 28th of June 2025 deadline and are not actively used in sort of delivering services. However, if they are essential to how a service operates, accessibility could still be required as well. And also when it comes to third-party content, so user-generated material that's sort of not under the control of the service provider is also exempt as well. So this may include things like embedded customer reviews or social media content that customers are producing as well. And lastly is online maps are exempt from regulations unless they're being used for navigation. So if the map is intended to help users sort of find a route or get directions, it will need to be made accessible. But if it's purely maybe sort of a visual map that they can interact with for directions, that doesn't come under it. But yeah, that's me kind of ran through a sort of overview of the EAA. So I'll now pass over to Harjit for sort of steps to compliance. So I'll pass over to you, Harjit.
Thanks, Kieran. Yeah, so now I'm going to go into the steps of meeting the EAA requirements. Well, starting off with the key steps. So firstly, assess. So in terms of looking at compliance, it requires a structured approach to ensure digital products meet accessibility requirements. So starting off with assessing your current status of accessibility. So that could include conducting accessibility audits to identify any barriers in your digital products and to evaluate your organisation's capabilities to address these issues effectively. Then it's moving on to address. So once you've identified the gaps, the next step is to address them. So this involves prioritising findings from the audit, creating and maintaining accessibility statements, and ensuring that your procurement processes align with accessibility requirements. And then embed. So embed accessibility into your organisation's culture and workflows. So this involves developing robust policies, providing ongoing training for teams, and to implement systems for ongoing monitoring and growth. And this helps to ensure continuous compliance and improvements. So I'm going to look into each step deeper to help you understand how to implement each step effectively. So looking at assess the status of accessibility. So the current version of the EN standard EN 301509 is the baseline on how accessibility requirements and EAA compliance can be met. So the current version of the EN standard applies WCAG 2.1. This is something that Kieran's already mentioned, and this serves as the benchmark for digital accessibility and supports compliance with the EA accessibility requirements. Again, I would like to point out this standard currently aligns with WCAG 2.1 level AA, which is not the latest version of WCAG 2.2. And this is because the EN standard does not yet incorporate the latest version, but the process to include this latest version is underway, although not yet complete. So we would recommend implementing WCAG 2.2 standards. This proactive approach ensures compliance, also showcases a genuine commitment to accessibility, and also safeguards your service against any potential future legal risks. So looking at the legislation in more detail, the Annex 1 of the EA outlines technical requirements for making products and services accessible, and this includes the core principles, which is the foundation for WCAG. So this includes perceivable, so content must be perceivable through different senses. Operable, so users must be able to interact with the interface, either using a keyboard, a mouse, or voice commands. Understandable, so information and functionality should be clear and predictable. And robust, so content must remain compatible across different devices and technologies. So when conducting an audit, using the core principles that I've mentioned and against WCAG, it is important to use a structured multi-step process. This ensures a robust, thorough audit. So starting with automated testing, so begin with automated tools such as Wave or Accessibility Insights to quickly identify common accessibility issues. This could be identifying missing alternative text or colour contrast problems. But it's important to bear in mind this a lot of automated tools only capture about 30% of issues, so this is a good starting point, and then move on to manual testing. So this is performing manual checks to uncover issues such as is there a logical navigation on the page? Is the content readable? Is there a proper focus order? So these are the core things to look at when you're doing manual testing. And then moving on to testing with assistive technology. So this helps and get an understanding of the user's experience by testing with different assistive technologies, such as screen readers, looking at keyboard navigation, voice commands, and this helps identify any accessibility barriers. And when conducting an audit, it's important to test across different digital platforms. This is important to ensure compatibility with various different assistive technologies, such as screen readers, voice command technology, and a range of devices and operating systems used by people with disabilities. I've got a table here with the most common platforms and assistive technology recommended by GDS. This ensures that a website or an app is accessible to all, regardless of what operating system you're using, assistive technology you're using, or any browser that you use. It should be accessible regardless. And before tackling EAA compliance, it's important to evaluate your internal accessibility capabilities. So this assessment ensures you choose the most effective approach, whether it's in-house or external support. It's important to identify this to help meet requirements. So to do this, you can start by assessing accessibility expertise within your organisation. So this involves evaluating whether your team has the necessary skills in areas such as accessibility testing, strategy, training, and usability testing. Identify whether your team can handle key tasks such as conducting thorough accessibility audits, testing using different assistive technology, and delivering specialised training. And conducting a gap analysis will help determine the best approach. So if your team lacks expertise or resources, consider external support from accessibility specialists who can conduct comprehensive audits and provide specialised guidance. Or if you do have this skilled in-house team, focus on building their skills through training and hands-on experience. And why is this important? So it helps understand the right approach to accessibility site testing, and this is essential. It helps optimise resources, ensure compliance with regulations such as the EAA, and importantly, improve the user experience. And the chosen approach should balance expertise and scalability, but also help ensure thorough accessibility testing is conducted. So now that we've looked at the status of accessibility, I'm going to move on to addressing issues. So once an accessibility audit is complete, the next step is to address identified issues. So often there can be potentially like a large number of issues that have came out in an audit or say usability testing, and that can feel overwhelming. So prioritisation is key to tackling the issues effectively. And a good approach to use is to prioritise using severity. So got a table here which shows severity ratings that are like categorised with high impact, medium, low severity. So this is the level of impact it's having on the user. It also includes positives, so good examples of accessibility to maintain for your team to be aware of and to continue to preserve. And observations, so any issues are not a failure, say within WCAG, but usability issues also is helpful to be aware of. And this prioritisation helps focus on resolving the most important barriers for users first. Also helps allocate resources effectively, track progress systematically over time, and communicate accessibility status and plans clearly to key stakeholders. And using this approach, it's then helpful to, after you've resolved the issues, perform a spot check, and this will help ensure the fixes have been implemented correctly and no new accessibility barriers have been introduced. This step is crucial for maintaining the quality and accuracy of your accessibility improvements, and then to move on and to reflect the progress made by updating your accessibility statement. And that is what I'm going to move on to now. So any accessibility improvements or remaining issues must be documented in an accessibility statement. This is a key requirement under the EAA. And the EAA mandates that businesses prepare and maintain accessibility information, and this is outlined in Annex 6 in the legislation, and this is for as long as the service is available. So an accessibility statement is a public declaration that communicates accessibility status, policies and practices of a website or an app. Informs users, including those with disabilities, about how accessible digital content is, and it helps demonstrate transparency and accountability. The statement should convey the accessibility status, any known issues, any planned improvements, and also detail any user guidance and workarounds. It's a really important document. It's more than just a compliance tool. It helps build trust and demonstrates your commitment to ensuring that all users can access the services and products, and it also serves as a tool to to highlight any progress that your organisation has made, any improvements. It shows accountability and your dedication to accessibility standards. Just going to get some water. So I'm going to now look at the accessibility statement and what it should include in more detail. So it should include the current level of compliance. So it should clearly state the level of accessibility. If it's partially compliant with MCAG 2.2 level A or fully compliant, you should aim to use plain language, and this helps to ensure that everyone can understand what compliance means, how it impacts on their experience. And if the website is not compliant, explain why, if there's any exemptions, detail that in the accessibility statement. You should state any known accessibility issues and barriers. So list areas or features that are not accessible, explain the reasons for these issues, such as, if there's any technical constraints or any pending updates, and provide alternatives where possible. So say, for example, you've got a graph on your website which is not accessible, provide an alternative like an accessible table that conveys that information. Detail planned improvements and timelines. So outline any planned upgrades to address any accessibility issues, include any estimated timelines, share details about ongoing efforts such as audits or updates, and have contact details for feedback or support. So provide clear contact information for users to report any accessibility problems or request any alternative formats. And this should include details of the person or team responsible for accessibility. And include a date of the last update of the accessibility statement. So detail when it was last reviewed or updated, and this helps show that you're actively maintaining accessibility within your organisation. Detail any regular updates. It should, ideally regularly update, so like annually or after any major updates. And mention when the last accessibility test, accessibility audit was conducted and whether it was done internally or if it was an external agency that conducted the audit. This is all key information for users to convey. So I'm going to pass over to Kieran now, who's going to talk about procurement, how to procure accessible services. So I'll pass over to Kieran.
Thank you, Harjit. Thank you, Harjit. So, yeah, as Harjit mentioned, we're going to have a wee look at how the EAA impacts the procurement process, particularly when buying or renewing digital products and services. So, the EAA places legal requirements on the organisation to ensure any external purchased digital services are accessible. So that means accessibility can't be an afterthought. It needs to be embedded into sort of every stage of the procurement process. This table outlines sort of key actions to take before purchasing and during the contract stage itself. So I'll just quickly run through the key things you need to do. So firstly, before purchase, so the first thing to do is just set your accessibility requirements as early on. So do you want to be to WCAG 2.2? Do you want to EN 301 549 as your benchmark? So be specific with your suppliers, as they also need to know what standards they're expected to meet, what they need to, and that allows them to decide what approach they need to take to building their product and service as well. The next thing is just make sure that you're researching your suppliers. So check their track record on accessibility. Have they worked on accessible products before? Can they show evidence of good practice? Do they have any case studies or previous work that you can have a look at? All of this just helps you get a better understanding of their knowledge level as well, because you don't want to be going to them and then find out later on that they don't actually know anything about accessibility. You can also request VPATs or ACRs. So these help assess whether the supplier's products meet your accessibility standards. You can read through that, and then that'll tell you maybe areas that they fail in terms of accessibility, areas where they excel, all of these kind of things. You can get all that information there. And then if possible, test or demo the product. So try it out yourself. run through it with assistive technology like a screen reader, voice control tools, just to see how it would maybe perform in the real world. You can double check maybe to see if form fields are accessible or if buttons have accessible names. Just kind of test out these wee things kind of quickly just to get a sense of how it looks as well. And just moving on to during the contract phase itself. So make sure that accessibility expectations are written into the contract and service level agreement. So that includes who's responsible, how issues will be handled, and what happens if these standards aren't met. And also include remediation plans. So if accessibility problems are discovered post-launch, the contract should say what steps the supplier will take and how quickly they'll act. Because if you have a product or service that isn't accessible, and then you've not written this into the contract, you're likely to be liable for it. So it's just important to make sure that you keep that in mind. And also check that the contract aligns with your internal policy. So this helps ensure that accessibility stays sort of consistent across your digital estate. So you've not got one area of your website say that's really accessible and then maybe another part of it isn't accessible. You want to make sure that's accessible across the board. And finally, plan for ongoing monitoring. So accessibility isn't just sort of a one and done. You'll want to have a clear process for reviewing performance and reassessing your service over time. So making sure that, as Harjit said, make sure you're testing it and then updating your accessibility statement, and just make sure you've got a plan in place for how you're going to go about that. So in short, just build accessibility into the procurement process from the very start, not just to comply with the EAA, but to actually future-proof your organization and to ensure that an inclusive experience for all users just going forward as well. So now that we've ran through that, I'll pass back to Harjit, who's going to go through actually embedding the accessibility.
Thank you. Yeah. So now that I've looked at, assessing, addressing, now it's about embedding accessibility into processes. So this means implementing accessibility best practices to make accessibility part of business as usual for all products and services. So embedding accessibility into policy is important for meeting EAA requirements and ensuring long-term compliance. So you can start with processes and documentation. So the EAA requires businesses to maintain accessible documentation, including details on how products and services meet standards. You can regularly update. So it's important to regularly update processes and documentation to ensure ongoing compliance, especially when services are, updated if there's any changes made. Ensuring accessibility is part of development life cycles. Sorry, that was a bit of a tongue twister. So embedding accessibility into product and service life cycles prevents accessibility barriers early. So it's important to ensure accessibility is considered from the onset. So you can look at, say, if WCAG requirements can be added as annotations and designs. Is there strong communication between design and development teams? And having accessibility built into design systems helps have accessibility built in from the start. And this aligns with the EAA requirement to design for accessibility before products are placed on the market, which helps save time and resources later. So training and support for teams. So staff training is essential under the EAA to ensure all teams, say if you're part of a design team, development, marketing, customer service. I know there's within our audience today, there's a range of different roles. So it's important that everyone can understand accessibility best practices, and it helps ensure consistency and integration of accessibility across the organisation. And this is like a theme that's been mentioned quite a bit today, but ongoing monitoring and evaluation. So regularly having regular audits, evaluations to monitor compliance, embedding accessibility and policy ensures systematic reviews to identify any non-compliant areas, prioritise fixes, and to help maintain adherence to the EAA. So I would say that embedding accessibility into policy demonstrates, again, a proactive approach to compliance and a commitment to creating and maintaining accessibility products and services. It helps integrate accessibility as like standard practice as opposed to something that you're, retrofitting. So yeah, policy is key. I've mentioned trainings, looking into this in more detail now. So accessibility is not a one-time fix, it's continuous awareness, education across the organisation. So why is ongoing training important? It helps, be compliant with legislation such as the EAA. It helps empower teams and create and maintain accessible digital products. It enhances customer satisfaction by addressing customer needs. So, these are all core. It's why it's so important to have, training within your organisation. And it's helpful to have training that is relevant for different roles and also across organisations. So it doesn't just sit with one person or one team. That can often happen in an organisation where there's maybe one person that holds all this knowledge. So it's important to have that consistency in terms of skills across organisation. And I've noted here like key areas of training. So understanding accessibility. So why is it important? Impact it has on users, understanding like the legal requirements, and designing accessible content. So this is looking at best practices for inclusive design and development, testing, maintaining accessibility. So how to monitor and improve over time, and responding to accessibility requests. So how can you build in effective processes for customer support? So, it's important to implement a continuous learning approach, and I've got a few examples here of how you can implement that approach. So having regular workshops and training sessions, and this helps keep teams updated, say with like evolving standards and legislation. Offer practical training tailored to, particular roles. So you could say have training for developers. You can have findings from an audit within that training, which is relevant. It helps developers understand how you can actually resolve issues down to like a code level. So having that relevant training is really important to, get that really, good understanding and hands-on experience. And also like having empathy workshops. This is a really good way of raising awareness across the organisation. Having accessible personas. This is helpful to help illustrate the needs for users with disabilities, and helps promote empathy and inclusive design. And I've touched on this before, like having the importance of having like that knowledge and awareness of accessibility across the organisation, and having accessibility champions helps promote that. So this is like a network of accessibility champions across departments to advocate for accessibility and share expertise. And these champions can provide guidance, help troubleshoot issues, and just really help ensure accessibility is prioritised from the start of projects. So I've mentioned this before, but looking at this in more detail. So looking at the importance of ongoing monitoring and growth, which is essential for ensuring compliance and successfully embedding accessibility into your organisation. So accessibility compliance is an ongoing process. I know we've got a deadline coming up of June 2025. Fast approaching, but that's the start, not the end of the process. So you should continuously monitor, adapt, and improve to meet evolving standards and user needs. And you can do this by proactively monitoring and conducting audits. So conduct regular audits and spot checks after any, major updates to help identify any non-compliant areas. You use insights from monitoring to refine processes, ensuring future changes align with accessibility standards. Having documentation and reporting information. So maintain detailed reports of testing methods, audit findings, how issues have been resolved, and any user feedback to demonstrate compliance efforts. Publish and update accessibility statements. This should detail like ongoing, so outline any long-term goals, known barriers, and ongoing improvements. Usability testing, so engaging with people with disabilities to help identify any barriers and improve the overall experience. my experience of conducting audits, that's a good starting point of looking at how to resolve the technical issues. But then moving on to usability testing with disabled people that use a range of different assistive technologies is really valuable. It's a really good way to get like true insights of the usability, the accessibility of the product. And to incorporate this feedback into compliance documentation strategies for practical improvements. Another good way of monitoring and having ongoing growth is having feedback and complaint mechanisms. So set up accessibility and user-friendly channels for feedback. You could have like a dedicated accessibility email address or contact forms. And this allows users with disabilities to report issues directly. And have establish a efficient response process to help address any complaints and use feedback to inform and improve user experiences. And lastly, but importantly, is to celebrate success. So share any case studies, examples of accessibility outcomes to highlight the benefits for users and the business. And this should help to improve and really motivate teams to embed accessibility. So yes, I've covered quite a bit there, but it's really about, implementing these practices so you can maintain compliance with the EAA, but also build trust with users, improve usability, and ensure accessibility is maintains in the long term. So I'm going to pass over to Kieran now, who's going to go through the summary, wrap up today's session.
Thank you, Harjit. Yeah, we'll just have a quick look at kind of summarise what we've had a look at quickly this morning. So just to wrap up, the key takeaways that we hope you take away from today's session is firstly that the EAA applies to both EU and non-EU businesses as long as they're offering digital products and services to customers within the EU. So that includes UK-based organisations trading the EU market. And when working with, we've went over the several different deadlines. Obviously, the main deadline that's coming up is for new products and services in June. So that's one of the key deadlines to look at. But there's all these other deadlines as well, like in 2030 and everything like that. So it's just important to keep an eye on all these different deadlines as well. Excuse me, sorry. Yeah, and just make sure that when you're implementing all of these things that we've mentioned today, just make sure that you're embedding accessibility across different teams, including developers, designers, content designers, procurement. Just make sure accessibility is built into everything that you do. And that way it'll make it a lot easier to actually meet the EAA requirements as well. And as I went over earlier on, just make sure that you're setting clear accessibility expectations in the contracts and through tools like VPATs as well. So when you're in the contract phase and if you're procuring any product or service, just make sure that the accessibility is built into that as well, so that you're discussing that with whoever you're buying your product or service off of. And just make sure, as Harjit went over, just make sure that you're keeping your accessibility statement up to date and include ways for users to give feedback as well, because you want that user feedback, because there might have been things that haven't came up during accessibility audits, and you want them to be able to let you know that they've maybe found an issue on a particular page. Finally, remember the benefits go beyond compliance, so accessibility improves the usability, expands your reach to new markets, and shows a strong commitment to inclusion and responsibility. So it's just really important to go beyond compliance as well. It's so easy to think, oh, I'll just meet WCAG or meet the EAA requirements, but if you go beyond it, then you're going to create an even better experience for all users. So yeah, here hopefully you've enjoyed today's session. If you would like we've got some more resources here that you may be interested in. We've got a QR code for the actual EU directive itself. And on our website, we've got a couple of articles that you may be interested in. One on a definitive guide for the European Accessibility Act. And the second is just looking if you want to learn more about these accessible documentation, so the VPATs and ACRs and accessibility statements as well. And also Harjit has an article coming out soon for a roadmap to compliance. So keep an eye out for that if you would like to have a wee read of that as well. And that's not all. We've got some training courses coming up as well. So if you'd be interested in things like conducting inclusive user research, the CPAC certification and mastering accessible document creation, we've got all of these coming up as well. Again, we've got a QR code, or you can visit our website. But thank you so much for coming today. And again, thank you for coming after we had to reschedule everything. So if you've got any questions, please put it in the chat, or you can send us a little email afterwards. Our emails are just on the screen, so you can contact us, harji@uservision.co.uk or kieran@uservision.co.uk, and we'd love to hear from you. So if you've got any questions, please let us know. So thank you all so much.